David Albert, and it's my pleasure that you're here. David, many thanks for accepting our invitation.
Thank you.
It's really great to have you in Argentina. And the title is just the same as the workshop, but the other way around. Time from the whole universe to local systems.
Thank you. Thank you. Forgive me for being low-tech and old-fashioned. I only have 2 slides, and I find that if I don't write the talk out and read it, I forget 50% of what I want to say. So have pity on an old man and forgive me for all that. Okay. Our everyday macroscopic experience of being in the world is saturated with asymmetries, thermodynamic asymmetries, and radiative asymmetries, and epistemic asymmetries, and phenomenological asymmetries, and asymmetries of overdetermination, and asymmetries of influence, and what have you, between the past and the future. And there's a long cherished hope, something that has its origins in the work of Boltzmann, and which has been pursued by any number of other investigators through any number of fits and starts and revelations and wrong turns ever since. There's a hope, that is, that all of those asymmetries can ultimately be traced back to some relatively simple characteristic of the initial macro condition of the universe. The thought, as people put it nowadays, is that all we need to do in order to account for these asymmetries is to add to the fundamental time reversal symmetric dynamical laws and to the standard statistical mechanical probability measure over the space of possible fundamental physical states, a simple postulate, a so-called past hypothesis, to the effect that the world first came into being in whatever particular low entropy macro condition it is that the normal inferential procedures of cosmology are eventually going to present to us. The business of working this thought out in detail is a large undertaking, which is still very much in its infancy, and which is still a topic of very lively debate, and I don't want to attempt anything along the lines of an overview of that project here. All I want to talk about today is a widespread and fundamental and perennial sort of puzzlement about how it is that such a project could even seriously be entertained. A puzzlement, that is, about how it is that the macro condition of the universe 15 billion years ago, all by itself, could even imaginably be up to the job of explaining so much about the feel today and on Earth of the passing of time. The puzzlement takes a number of different forms and arises in a number of different contexts. On the most trivial level, there's a question of how the lowness of the entropy of the world 15 billion years ago can impose any genuinely profound and vivid constraints, whatever, on what the world is doing now. And all that needs to be said in order to make that sort of puzzlement go away is that although 15 billion years is a long time, the entropy of the universe at that time was very, very low, and that in particular 15 billion years is a great deal shorter than the expected relaxation time of the state in which our universe seems to have started out. But there's a somewhat more interesting question in the general vicinity of this first one about how the lowness of the entropy of the world 15 billion years ago can have any genuinely profound and vivid effects or impose any genuinely profound and vivid constraints on what particular localized human-scale, quasi-isolated subsystems of the world are doing now. There's a worry in particular that runs like this. Let it be stipulated that the standard Boltzmannian arguments do indeed establish that the overall entropy of a universe which starts out in a low entropy past hypothesis sort of macro state is overwhelmingly likely to rise toward the future. People are fond of pointing out that this tells us nothing at all in and of itself and considered as a purely logical matter about the behaviors of the entropies of quasi-isolated subsystems of the world. Just as the fact that dogs can run tells us nothing at all in and of itself and considered as a purely logical matter about whether or not dogs' heads can run. And it is the behavior of quasi-isolated subsystems of the world, after all, and not the universe as a whole, that the science of thermodynamics is primarily, and in the first instance, concerned with. And all of this, considered as a purely logical matter, is surely true. But it seems to me to ignore or to overlook or to misunderstand how the Boltzmannian arguments actually work. The core of what the Boltzmannian tradition has given us is a general strategy for assigning specific numerical probabilities to any propositions whatsoever about the macro conditions of isolated thermodynamic systems at any time t greater than t0, given the macro condition of the system at t0. And the argument to the effect that the thermodynamic systems in non-equilibrium macro conditions, the argument to the effect that thermodynamic systems in non-equilibrium macro conditions are overwhelmingly likely to increase their entropies as time goes forward is simply an application of that general strategy to the special case of entropy. The business of actually calculating those probabilities in physically interesting cases is usually going to be prohibitively complicated. But what Boltzmann and his various collaborators and inheritors are widely thought to have made plausible is that those probabilities are in good accord with the entirety of our everyday thermodynamic experience. If, for example, the isolated system in question consists of two gases which are initially at different temperatures and which are in thermal contact with one another, what the Boltzmannian arguments make plausible is not merely that the overall entropy of this system is likely to go up towards the future, but in addition that the entropy of the hotter gas is overwhelmingly likely to go down toward the future. And if the isolated system in question consists of, say, 12 isolated gases in 12 separate containers, each of which is initially far from its own individual equilibrium state, then what the Boltzmannian arguments are going to make plausible is not merely that the overall entropy of this system is overwhelmingly likely to go up towards the future, but in addition that the separate entropies of each of those 12 gases are all individually overwhelmingly likely to go up toward the future. Of course, the probability that the entropy of some particular one of those gases goes down toward the future will be much larger than the probability that the overall entropy of the 12 of them together goes down toward the future. But both of those probabilities are going to be fantastically small. Good. Then there's a third question in the general vicinity of these first two. And this is the deeper and more interesting and more amorphous and more subtle form of the puzzlement about the Boltzmannian project that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. And it's this third question that I want to mainly focus on today. Let me put the question in four increasingly concrete and increasingly simple and increasingly tractable ways. One, how can it seriously be imagined that my own sense of the passage of time, how can it seriously be imagined, for example, that my own sense right here and right now of whether some particular baseball happens to be flying towards me or away from me is somehow anchored to the lowness of the entropy of the universe 15 billion years ago? Second form, how can it be, how can it work that the increase of the entropy of the world or of myself somehow constitutes the standard or the yardstick against which I judge the direction in which events are unfolding? How is it, that is, that the entropy gradient of anything ever comes into the picture? I'm certainly not aware of checking on the entropy gradient of anything in the course of deciding whether the baseball is flying towards me or away from me. No comparison with anything else, insofar as I'm consciously aware, is involved. I simply directly, unmediatedly see that the baseball is either flying towards me or away from me. Third form of the question. Consider the sense of the direction of time that's implicit in the operations of, for example, a simple mechanical realization of a Turing machine. Can anyone seriously believe? That's the second that I've been quoted saying that phrase earlier in this conference. I seem to have a tendency to say it a lot. Can anyone seriously believe that thermodynamical characteristics of the world somehow play a role in the way a machine like that distinguishes between what it has just done and what it's supposed to do next? How? How can that be? How would that work? Machines like that can apparently function perfectly well. Machines like that apparently have no trouble at all in distinguishing between what they have just done and what they are to do next, without the aid of special devices for measuring the entropy gradient of the world or of themselves or anything else. Fourth form of the question, and this will be the most concrete one and the most tractable one. Consider, finally, a simple mechanical device which has no other business than reliably distinguishing between what it has just done and what it's supposed to do next. The paradigmatic distinguisher, the distinguisher par excellence between what it has just done and what it's to do next. Think, that is, of a clock, and think, for the sake of concreteness, for the sake of simplicity, of an old-fashioned, fully mechanical pendulum clock. Good. Now we have our hands on something which we're in a position to analyze in detail. Note, to begin with, that in the course of the normal and intended operations of a clock like that, there are going to be moments in particular when the pendulum is precisely at the apogee of its swing, when every last one of its macroscopic moving parts is completely at rest. Note, to put it slightly differently, that in the course of the normal and intended operations of a clock like that, there are going to be moments, the moments again when the pendulum is precisely at the apogee of its swing, when the macro condition of the clock in its entirety is invariant under time reversal. And consider how it is at such moments that the clock manages to distinguish between what it's just done and what it's supposed to do next. The macro condition of the clock, together with the microscopic dynamical equations of motion, together with the statistical postulate, is manifestly not going to do the trick. For if the present macro condition of the clock, together with the microscopic dynamical equations of motion and the statistical postulate, makes it likely, excuse me, that the clock is going to read, say, 3:05 5 minutes from now, and if the present macro condition of the clock is invariant under time reversal, then the present macro condition of the clock, together with the microscopic dynamical equations of motion and the statistical postulate, both of which are invariant under time reversal as well, is necessarily also going to make it likely, and likely to exactly the same degree, that the clock read 3:05 5 minutes ago. And all there is to break the symmetry, all there is that stands in the way of the clocks having read 3:05 5 minutes ago, I submit, is the past hypothesis. The clock's ability to distinguish between what it did last and what it does next, and your ability to distinguish between a baseball's flying towards you and a baseball's flying away from you, is anchored in the entropy gradient of the universe. If we were to hold the present macro condition of the world fixed and move the past hypothesis from the beginning of time to its end, the clock would run backwards. Period. Case closed. End of story.